This lecture is entitled State and Church in the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300 AD. Our focus in this short lecture is some of the early history of England. As we saw before in a previous lecture, with the fall of Rome, England found itself in a very desperate situation. The original inhabitants of England, called the Celtic Britons, were suddenly overrun by various Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from Scandinavia or Northern Europe, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. These Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had been kept out of England by Roman armies. When the Romans withdrew from England, the Celtic Britons, who had come under the control of the Romans, were now left on their own to deal with these invaders of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. None of these groups, Celtic Britons, Angles, Saxons, or Jutes, was strong enough to gain control over the whole of England. Instead, what developed is the so-called Heptarchy, or 7 various kingdoms of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Celtic Britons, and until the late 800s, those kingdoms remained separate entities. England was not a unified whole after the collapse of the Roman Empire until the reign of a great king by the name Alfred the Great of Wessex, who reigned as the King of Wessex from 871 until 899. Alfred was a Saxon, and it is believed that he was probably the inspiration for the King Arthur myths, but that gets into stuff of speculation, so we don't know for sure about that. But Alfred's major claim to fame is that he unified all of those 7 distinct kingdoms of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Celtic Britons under his leadership from 871 to 899. Alfred the Great is the first king of England, the first king of unified England. This begins a period in English history called Anglo-Saxon England, and of course there are many kings of England, and this lecture is not intended to talk about all of those. We're just going to talk about a few. At one point in English history, from 1016 to 1035, the English found themselves under the control of a Viking king from Denmark by the name of Canute. Canute was shortly thereafter followed by a man named Edward Confessor, who reigned as the King of England from 1042 until his death in 1066. Edward Confessor's major problem was that he died without an heir. He had actually been married to a woman that was forced upon him by one of his noble advisors. This noble advisor had forced Edward Confessor to marry his daughter. This noble advisor's daughter was forced upon Edward Confessor because Edward Confessor was a very weak individual. He's what historians call a puppet king. It was this one noble advisor by the name of Godwin, Harold Godwin actually, who was the real ruler of England from 1042 to 1066. Edward Confessor was king in title only. He was controlled behind the scenes by this very powerful noble advisor named Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson had forced Edward Confessor to marry his daughter. So Harold Godwinson's daughter was by all accounts fairly attractive, but there is no evidence that exists to show that Edward Confessor and his wife ever had an intimate, truly married relationship, and this has been the stuff of debate for generations. Why didn't the two have an intimate relationship? Some have questioned the sexual preference of Edward Confessor. Some have said that he and his wife were so extremely religious that they were married in name only, that Edward lived as a monk and his wife lived as a nun, taking vows of celibacy, that they would be married but not married in every sense of the word. Some have said that this was Edward Confessor's revenge on Harold Godwinson, that he may have been forced to take Harold Godwinson's daughter as his wife, but she didn't have to be a true wife to him, therefore his revenge was to never sleep with her. So, whatever the reason why, Edward Confessor died in 1066 without an heir. And this posed a problem, as always is the case when there is no direct heir for a king. It often results in civil war or hard times for that particular country. Harold Godwinson had had a son, and many thought that Harold Godwinson's son, also named Harold, should succeed Edward Confessor. Some thought that perhaps a cousin of Edward Confessor's should be the King of England. I'll introduce him to you in just a second. So, long story short, there are many possible contenders, but there's no direct heir for Edward Confessor. What normally happened in England with the death of a king was a period of official mourning, where the people of England were supposed to, even if they weren't really, they were supposed to act depressed and upset for several months, wear black, etc., etc., and the job of the king would be done by his heir, his successor, but that heir or successor would not be officially crowned until several months of mourning had passed. Well, what we know about Edward Confessor's death is that he died early in the morning on a January day in 1066, and that very afternoon, despite tradition, Harold Godwinson's son, also named Harold, seized the throne and had himself officially coronated, rejecting tradition of months of mourning. So, on January 6th, 1066, the new King of England is Harold II. Why did Harold II skip the official period of mourning, rush to be coronated as king? What he's trying to do here is more or less gain the throne before some other person has time to come out of the woodwork, so to speak, to challenge him for the throne of England. It is telling that the reign of Harold II lasted just from January 6th, 1066 until October 14th, 1066. So we would assume from such a short reign, which lasted just about 10 months, that he must have encountered some problems, and he certainly did. Harold's major challenger for the throne of England was a cousin to Edward Confessor. This cousin was Norman, or actually French. Okay, Norman, saying that this cousin is Norman, means that he comes from Normandy, which was in northern France. So this cousin was not English at all. And this is why some people in England had sided with Harold II. And they said, well, maybe he shouldn't have skipped the official mourning period, but at least he's an Englishman. We don't want a French guy in control of England. But there were others in England and also in Normandy who felt that William the Norman had a more legitimate claim to the throne because he was a relative by blood. He was a cousin. He was not a relative by marriage, as was Harold II, who had been brother-in-law to Edward Confessor. So, essentially what happens is, over in Normandy, a man named William the Bastard, meaning illegitimate. He was an illegitimate son of a guy named Robert the Devil. But William the Bastard, as he was called, began to put together a force of professional French knights to go to England and claim the throne. William the Bastard, as he was called, began to exchange messages with Harold II, and he pointed out to him I'm a cousin, I'm a blood relative, you should do the right thing and step down and just give me the throne of England, spare your country a war between the two of us. Harold refused these demands. William pointed out, Harold, you also have some land in England and in France because I gave it to you, so technically in the feudal system you are my vassal, you're my servant. As your lord, I demand that you give the throne of England to me. Harold II refused. Ultimately, William and Harold end up in a battle against each other in northern England called the Battle of Hastings on 1066. Harold had a bit of a problem here. He did not have a professional army, unlike William. So Harold, as the King of England and kings before him, had a tendency to just put together a force whenever they needed it. So Harold is told by William that he's coming to do battle with him. And the place that they're going to fight is called Hastings. And Harold has to put together an army to do battle with William. The problem is that this is right smack during the middle of harvesting. And these English peasants are more interested in harvesting their crops than fighting for this guy, Harold II. They have more pressing concerns, bringing in their crops from the field. So Harold encourages these English farmers, these peasants, to come along with him and fight. So you have to understand he's recruiting as he heads towards Hastings, and at the same time trying to get these peasant farmers equipped with all of the swords that they will need for this battle, trying to train them as they make this march. And by the time actually the Battle of Hastings gets underway, Harold probably had figured out that it was not going to go well because these English peasant farmers were not interested. Many of them fled when the battle started. They didn't want to be there anyway. There were their crops to harvest. Why get killed for something they didn't care about anyhow? So the Battle of Hastings is a complete and total annihilation of Harold II and his forces. In fact, Harold II was killed on the battlefield by an arrow which pierced through his eye. William emerged as the champion at the Battle of Hastings. His name changed, which I'm sure he's grateful for. After 1066, his victory at the Battle of Hastings over Harold II, William was no longer called William the Bastard or William the Illegitimate. Instead, he was called William the Conqueror, or simply William the First, who reigned from 1066 to 1087 as the King of England. He is a Frenchman, and it is important to note that from 1066 until the early 1300s, all of the kings of England will be of French descent and French speaking. Some of the kings of England in this period from 1066 to the early 1300s didn't even speak English, and William is a good example of that. William was interested to know what he actually owned in England, what made up this country, how much wealth was in it. So he sent out these guys that we would associate with being sort of like census takers. And these guys went out throughout England, and they would knock on doors, and they would ask, okay, how many rooms are in this cottage? How many people live here? How old are they approximately? People didn't keep up with their birthdays or anything like this at this point. How many pigs? How many sheep? How much acreage do you have? And they tallied all of this information together in what was called the Domesday Book. And William used this knowledge to divide all of England among the soldiers who had helped him win it. So essentially what happens here is the feudal system is officially brought into England. About 25,000 Normans who had served William gained control over 2 million English men and women and all of their property. the vassalage of England occurs. The English people become vassals and servants to the Normans who have conquered their country. In this period, we see a dramatic change in the English language. To this point, the conquest of England by the Normans, the English spoken in England was very Germanic sounding and in structure and form, and it was called Old English. It is completely and totally unrecognizable to modern English speakers. The way our language began is just as foreign to us as something like German is today. So when the French or the Normans invade England, their language, French, mixes in with this Germanic Old English to form what we call Middle English. And though it has some strange sounding words and rhythm to it, Middle English is recognizable to modern English speakers. If any of you have ever read in Middle English the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, then you have, in fact, seen Middle English. This ends our lecture on State and Church in England.